let's start with Tuesday and what happened with the assembled 800 or so of the nation's top military advisors, both from the Army and from the other branches as well. And what was going on with that? Because there was a lot of alarm when Defense Secretary, and it is Defense Secretary, not Secretary of War. I think I might have said this to you before, although the administration has said that it wants to change that name, and I've talked about that before. That has to go through Congress. So it is still legally the Department of Defense. Anyway, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called a meeting very, very quickly for all these top advisors and top military officials to come in from all over the world from their assignments to the Marine base at Quantico, Virginia, on, as I say, very short notice. I think it was 4 days, pulling them off ships, pulling them from their missions, and so on, along with their top enlisted advisors. And many people were extremely concerned about that because it coincided with what looked like and turned out to be a government shutdown. What were they up to? Now, before I go into how that played out, I want to make the point that I don't think we make enough in the United States, and that's that the job of the government, of any government, before it does anything else, the job is to keep the nation safe, safe from invasion, safe from attack. It is to keep the people safe. Now, in the United States, our our land base has largely been safe since World War II. So people tend to forget that the military actually has a job. It's not just part of some international chess game, that in fact it has a minute by minute job of keeping the United States safe. So pulling all these people to one specific place and making it public in that manner was really dangerous and highly, I mean, unprecedented. Nobody does that, or nobody did it until Secretary Hegseth did it last week. So people were justifiably very concerned about whether there was going to be a new policy or what was going to happen at that event. And the first day when he first called everyone together, there was a lot of rumors circling around, and what were they going to do, and was it going to be like, other authoritarian regimes where they kill everybody, or was it going to be a loyalty oath, or was it going to be whatever? Well, news started to drop pretty quickly that this was going to be a talk about the warrior ethos. And I'll be frank, I did not think that that was correct, that there had to be something bigger than that. And in fact, what we saw was on Tuesday was the Secretary of Defense haranguing professionals who are highly trained and incredibly qualified and true professionals, with the idea that the military has to be reworked along some kind of hyper white Christian nationality in order to be truly lethal. And that was deeply problematic, not only because every possible study will tell you the opposite is true, but also because Hegseth was in the military fairly briefly, rose to the rank of a major, but uh, his job before he came to the head of the Pentagon was he was a weekend host on the Fox News channel. So he looked the part of a military advisor to President Donald Trump, but he doesn't have the experience. He is not a career military person, and all the things that one could say about him. So watching him lecture these professionals was deeply embarrassingly painful for those of us who understand the difference between those two things. Now, there was a couple ways that mattered. First of all is that lots of people talk about whether the military will hold if Trump tries to weaponize them. And I think if you watched that speech, what you saw was professionals. And what really jumped out to me is that um, I talk a lot about the history of the military, which is different adjacent but different than the history of the United States. And a lot of people make the mistake of taking a look at them and assuming that they are partisan. And I have never served in the military, and I could be entirely wrong in what I am about to observe. But what I saw was something that reminded me a lot of myself. That is, when I look at the world, I look at the larger stream of American history. There are presidents I like, there are presidents I dislike, there are presidents I support, there are presidents I don't support. But to me, they are all transient. That is, they're going to be here, they're going to go away, and my loyalty is to the much larger stream of American history. And I get kind of salty when people accuse me of being a shill either for the Republicans or the Democrats. People accuse me on both sides because while I certainly like and dislike different things, I just don't even think that way. And that's what I saw in that military. Those are leaders who are loyal to the institution of the US military and its role in defending the United States of America. That's really different than partisanship. Even if they vote for a Republican or vote for a Democrat, it's a different way of looking at things. And it's important to remember that in the past, when you have seen military figures supporting Donald Trump, they have not been the senior people. They have been much more junior people. And the military frowns on that. That's absolutely not acceptable among the military. So what I saw was a number of extremely qualified people looking at somebody who is not going to be there forever and really recognizing how outlandish what he was saying was. Okay, that matters because the next person to speak was Donald Trump, who spoke for 70 minutes, give or take, and you can find the transcripts online. Um, but he spoke in a way that was deeply, deeply, deeply unhinged. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I want to work in another question that people asked about the military. And you've said, is Donald Trump going to do what he suggested in that speech, which was use the military against American citizens? And the answer to that is I don't know. First of all, I don't know. I never know what's going to happen in the future, but I want to change the direction of your vision a little bit and recognize, as I keep saying, all of the branches of the military are covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. That's the 1878 law that says that the military cannot be used as a law enforcement entity against American citizens. And someday I'm actually going to write down the history of the Posse Comitatus Act because it's a little bit different than people know. And I think I've talked about it here before. But the exception to what I just said, the military is covered by the Posse Comitatus Act, but the Department of Homeland Security is not. The Department of Homeland Security is a very new department in the United States. And in fact, we want its officers generally to enforce the law. And what I mean by that is within the Department of Homeland Security, we have our coasties, the United States Coast Guard. And anybody who lives on the coast is a huge fan of the Coast Guard. I mean, I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody, but there's a reason we call them our coasties. They enforce the law on the coastline and they rescue people who get into trouble. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security. We need them to enforce those laws. There are also other law enforcement organizations within the Department of Homeland Security that we want to have enforcing the law. People like the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and I think it's explosive devices. I never remember what that last piece is. Anyway, they are not covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. And one of the things that people keep confusing is they keep talking about how Trump is deploying the military in the streets. And yes, there have been federalized National Guard troops and Marines in Los Angeles. There are federalized National Guard troops now in Memphis. There have been federalized National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., and there are now 200 federalized National Guard troops going into Portland, Oregon. That's all true. But the people who are cracking heads right now all across the country are part of the Department of Homeland Security. They are members of either the Border Patrol or of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Those people are the ones who are doing these extraordinary warrantless sweeps that like happened on Tuesday in Chicago, in which they simply went door to door on a 5-story apartment building on the South Shore and took everybody out except one guy who had double barred his door and went back to bed. That man can sleep through anything, apparently. Took them all out and put them in zip ties, including, men, women, children, some of whom were naked, held them outside for hours, ended up arresting 37 of them or detaining 37 of them and telling everybody else they could go. There were American citizens in that group. And again, this is being challenged right now in court as a violation of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, part of our Bill of Rights, which protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures. But when you talk about fears of declaring martial law, Trump is doing this without declaring martial law. This is ICE doing it, and ICE has a huge budget, and they are detaining people. They are detaining American citizens. This is a huge, huge deal, and it's getting local attention and it's getting some national attention, but not nearly enough national attention, because when it does get attention, as in the case in New York, where an ICE agent took a young woman and threw her against a wall into the floor, ICE has to back off a little bit. So before you worry too much about um, military, I'm sorry, martial law, which, by the way, is not Marshall like James Marshall Hendricks, Marshall. It's Marshall like as in war, Martial, like the god Mars, the god of war. That is certainly something that the administration is playing with, and it's playing with it. We saw in a declaration today that the U.S. is at war with drug cartels, although the administration did not spell out what it meant by drug cartels, and most legal analysts are saying this is just simply not going to hold water. It is dancing around that issue because that would give the president really quite large powers, but it doesn't need that to cause extraordinary havoc among our neighbors. So before you worry too much about that coming, ICE is already here, and ICE is already detaining U.S. citizens as well as undocumented immigrants, as well as immigrants who are here lawfully, whose status sometimes changes because of the changes the administration is making, and are detaining people that they claim are criminals. But we all know at this point they're trying to fill their quotas by taking anybody who might have any kind of warrant or anything in their past, any kind of blemish in their past that enables them to add them to their quotas. So before you worry too much about martial law, remember that ICE is already here, and ICE is already incredibly damaging to the social fabric and to this country. All right, so part of that, you asked, where are the detainees that ICE has gathered? And I want to reemphasize here, as I keep doing, the administration is making it very, very, very difficult to figure out what they're doing by simply refusing to release any information about anything. So we know that people are disappearing into the system, and we don't know how or when they come out. There are people who track what appear to be ICE flights to other countries. We don't know the names of the people on those flights. And people ask a lot about the detainees who appear to have disappeared from the detention center in the Florida Everglades, whose nickname I refuse to use. Those people, there are all kinds of concern about what has happened to those people. It's just entirely possible that they have been rendered to another country, that they have been deported, that they are in different detention facilities, that those records are not accessible to people who are trying to find that out, including family members. It does not necessarily, I should say necessarily, it probably does not mean that they have been unalived, but that they have been hidden somewhere, moved somewhere, rendered somewhere, pushed out of the United States into a place where their lives are certainly unstable. But just to lay a little bit of comfort, perhaps anyway, over that. I'm not going to dig too much more into that, but I do want to point out how much what is happening in the United States right now looks like Reconstruction. That is the period in the United States after the Civil War in which a very small group of reactionary white Southerners used terror, which is what the ICE um, sweeps are designed to do, to gain political control over the American South for 80 years. And the key thing that we have today that Reconstruction era Americans did not have is the ability to communicate with each other and the ability to post videos and the ability to call this stuff out in real time when the administration says, for example, over that ICE raid in Chicago, that they arrested people who were members of a gang. We have the ability to say, as people did almost instantly, you have no evidence of that. You have not produced any evidence of that. And until you do, we're going to have to assume you just did a random sweep of these people. All right. So the other thing that was important about what happened on Tuesday was that Trump, as I say, was not well. He was not well in that speech. And that's not just me talking. I'm going to give you more information about that in a minute. But he was rambling. He was really unable to be coherent. At times he seemed to be reading off a teleprompter, but then he would free associate. And he was treating this meeting as if it were a rally of some sort. Although even his rallies used to be more organized than that, mentally organized than that. But it was not a rally. It was a meeting of the United States military brass, the people who are most responsible for keeping us safe. And what it did by live streaming it was it demonstrated to the world, not just to the United States and not just to military officials, that the president of the United States is not mentally competent. And that's a really, really big problem. And I want you to listen to something. I pulled this from his 70-minute speech, which he started to talk about Joe Biden, who, by the way, he mentioned, I think, was 11 times in that speech, which is highly unusual. But he said, they looked at him falling downstairs every day. Every day, the guy is falling downstairs, which is, Biden was riding a bike. He's still in really good physical shape. And then he said, I'm very careful. When I walk downstairs for like a month, stairs like these stairs, I walk very slowly. Listen to this. Nobody has to set a record. Just try not to fall because it doesn't work out well. A few of our presidents have fallen and it became a part of their legacy. We don't want that. You walk nice and easy. You don't have to set any record. Be cool. Be cool when you walk down, but don't pop down the stairs. And then he free associated about Obama. Listen to what I just read. Doesn't it sound like medical advice? To me, it just really jumped out that he was repeating what a doctor had said to him. Nobody has to set a record. Just try not to fall because it doesn't work out well. A few of our presidents have fallen and it became part of their legacy. We don't want that. You walk nice and easy. You don't have to set any record. Be cool. Be cool when you walk down. I thought that really jumped out in that speech, an admission that there was something physically, at the very least, and I would say mentally, that was certainly on the mind of Trump and possibly of his medical advisors. Now, he did a couple of other things on Tuesday that people didn't necessarily put in the context of Tuesday and probably should have. One is that, remember, it was the day that the shutdown was about to happen, and the Democrats have said they would not give the Republicans cover for the budget reconciliation bill they passed in July. Remember that? That was the budget reconciliation bill that could have everything but including the kitchen sink, which it did, because it only needed Republican votes to pass. Budget reconciliation bills, there are a number of bills, very few, but two, I think it is, bills every year that can go through Congress without having to face a filibuster in the Senate. And someday I'll do a whole nother thing on the filibuster. But one of those is a budget reconciliation bill. So the Republicans needed no Democratic votes to pass that, and they just went for it. They went for broke. They got everything they wanted. They got a major tax cut for extension of the 2017 tax cut for the wealthy and corporations. They got slashing Medicare, Medicaid, but which also is going to involve cuts to Medicare. They got cuts to the supplemental nutrition program. They got cuts to energy, green energy programs, and so on. But one of the things that they appear to have overlooked, because this was done very hastily and it was a huge, huge measure. One of the things they did was they did not extend the premium tax credits. The premium tax credits are subsidies for purchasing healthcare insurance on the Affordable Care Act marketplace. With those expiring at the end of the year, people's insurance rates are going to skyrocket, and they're going to skyrocket enough that healthy Americans are almost certainly going to drop their ACA coverage, meaning they'll be uninsured. But that also means, which is bad enough, but that also about 4.2 million are estimated to be people who will drop off. But that also means that for those who remain on the ACA markets, the premiums are going to go up because the healthiest population just said we can't afford this, we're out. And that means that the population covered by those markets will be sicker and older and cost more to insure. So you're already seeing premiums skyrocketing. The numbers started coming out on October 1st. The Republicans desperately want the Democrats to own a piece of that. And voting for this extension until November 21st would make the Democrats, put the Democrats at least a little bit on the hook for saying, okay, we can live with what the Republicans did in what they are calling the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The Democrats call it the Big Ugly Bill. But so the Republicans know this is a losing issue. So they keep saying Democrats want $1.5 trillion for, I think it's trillion, it might be billion. I think it's trillion. I don't know. Sorry, I don't do numbers well. They keep saying that that the Democrats are simply trying to get health care for undocumented immigrants, which is simply not true. You know, they've got, and then Trump started saying they want trans athletes and throwing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with this actual fight and have a lot to do with Trump's usual rallying cries, which just don't have a lot of teeth anymore. So on Tuesday, Trump actually came out and he said, this shutdown is going to let us cut a lot of the things that they want. And by they, he meant Democrats. But he went on to say medical stuff, benefits, you know, the sorts of things that actually all Americans like. And so he did this. And then it was like all of a sudden he caught himself and he said, I mean, we don't want to do that. We're just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, even though we know that, in fact, the DOGE cuts from the Department of Government Efficiency did not do anything to address waste, fraud, and abuse. But so he did that, and that was on Tuesday. And I have not been madly online today. I've actually been writing, but Trump has not appeared in public since Tuesday, I don't believe. Instead, what you are seeing is him posting on social media deep fake videos, really offensive stuff, and seemingly staying off the stage, which is really interesting because you don't know what he's going to say next. So his handlers clearly do not want him in public. They want to use him to troll people, but they don't seem to want him out there. But what you all really want to know about is what's going on with the Republican Party. And this is, I'm going to both look at that on a small level, but then I'm going to get bigger and bigger because it certainly appears as though the Republican Party is crumbling. And that has a lot of different pieces to it. So, somebody has said, how frustrating it is that we've been saying now for a decade, and for what it's worth, I've been talking about it for like 30 years, that the Republican Party cannot continue the way it is. And yet here it still is. That's a fair criticism, I think. And what people like me do is we try to read the tea leaves and say, this is what things look like, and tell you what our evidence is, and you can disagree with it. So one of the things that you have seen, and a lot of you wrote in your questions lately, is the statement that a number of Republican members of Congress are thinking about resigning or retiring, not running again in 2026. And you asked me who they were and whether that was what that was going to be true. I don't know. That's in the future. And I can't predict the future for you. I can tell you that if they are leaking that to journalists, as they obviously are, they're very, very unhappy. And you saw a glimmer of that with Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican of Georgia, who announced that she is going to be resigning from Congress. I believe it's on January 5th, 2026, 3 days after she secures her pension, just FYI on that one. Um, but when she wrote a quite a long, it was a 4-page letter about why she felt that she was going to resign. And it was a really interesting letter. Now, I just want to get out ahead of the fact that I expect to see in all these comments, you can't trust her and, we don't like her and all that. 100%. I mean, the one thing that's really interesting about Greene is that she is a fairly astute political observer. And she goes where the prevailing winds are. That doesn't mean you have to like her. That doesn't mean you have to vote for her. That doesn't mean you have to believe anything she says. It does mean that it's worth listening to what she says because she has a good sense of where the people are on the ground. So she wrote this long letter, and you can get copies of it. It's on the internet. It's also on social media. But I'll lay out for you what's in it. She laid out in great detail how frustrated she was that people like her, and mind you, again, this is incredibly self-serving, right? Who's her audience? What's she doing? And you always think those things through. But that people like her who are trying to work for everyday Americans, I think she calls them common Americans, although I don't recall off the top of my head, can't get traction in Congress because of both parties that are working against her. Put a pin in that, because I'm going to come back to it in just a minute. Then she goes on to say that she doesn't want to be primaried by Trump and have him spend tens of millions of dollars to primary her, that is, to run somebody who is more pro-Trump even than her, to the right of her, only to, as she says, win the seat. Because she's not going to say, I think I'll lose. She said, I will win the seat. But then the Republicans are going to lose the majority in 2026. This is her talking, not me. And then we're going to have to defend the president against impeachment. And after he's just spent tens of millions of dollars to destroy me. So in that, I think you can read a lot of things. First of all, lots of people are saying that the Republicans are going to lose the majority in 2026. And there's every sign that that's the case. Again, put a pin in that one because I'm going to come back to it. But there is also her talking about impeachment, which one has to expect the House will move forward on if the Democrats have a majority, because to get articles of impeachment through the House, you only need a simple majority. To get them through, to get a conviction in the Senate, you need a lot more votes than that. So, but that's not necessarily out of reach. I'll come back to that too. So she is essentially saying, if the Democrats get the majority, we can expect that there will be an impeachment. Now, why would you impeach somebody if you knew they weren't going to be convicted? In part because you have hearings. The American people get to see what this person has done and decide whether or not they think it's bad. And in the case of Trump, I think we already know from his plummeting poll numbers. There were 2 polls that came out today that had him at 35%. Now, those are outliers on the negative side, but even still, he is down under 40% on average. We know that people don't like what he's doing. And we also know that the more stuff that comes out, the worse this administration looks. So it is not a huge leap to suggest that she's right when she says that we might well see impeachment if the Democrats get a majority in the next Congress. But more interesting than that is, and that certainly is why a lot of Republicans are talking about resigning or not running again or whatever, is partly because it's no fun to be in the minority. You can't really do very much. And also because of the leadership, as it is, of Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who is a Republican from Louisiana, who simply has been refusing to put forward anything, even that members of his own conference. I always get confused. The Democrats have a caucus, the Republicans have a conference. Even things that members of his own conference want, because he is doing Trump's bidding. He is very much doing Trump's bidding. And so a lot of those Republicans are like, I want to get out of here. I can't do anything. My constituents yell at me all the time because I'm trying to do stuff for them. Again, even Republicans are usually trying to do things that their members of their districts want. And I can't do anything because Mike Johnson keeps shutting me down. What's the point of this? I might as well be spending my time either doing what I want or running for a different sort of office. So you're actually seeing people focusing on going back to their states and working in their states. So that's that part of Marjorie Taylor Greene's letter was really interesting. But to my mind, more interesting is something that she articulated in that letter, or at least alluded to in that letter. It's not a terribly well-written letter, but that I'm seeing in a lot of other places. And that was two things. First of all, her emphasis on, I forget what she calls it, not a uniparty, but the idea that both the leadership of both the Republicans and the Democrats are not working for the common people. And also the idea that she is working for the common people. And she said, when the American public figures this out, I will be here for them. To my mind, that sounds like she's making a bid for power that does not involve MAGA, that she is looking at what seems to be the collapse of MAGA. I'll talk more about that in a second. And she is taking a chance on staking out a different kind of future by riding what seems to be a new kind of, it's an old kind of political wave, but for this moment, a new kind of political wave into the future. And that is a focus on the economic issues that the majority of Americans are now quite focusing on because of the degree to which the Republican Party has not been answering their needs. So the collapse of the Republican Party, or the crumbling of the Republican Party, looks to me very much like the crumbling of the Republican Party in the 1890s, or of the Whig Party and the Democratic Party in the 1850s. We lose the Northern Democrats almost across the board in 1855 and 1856, after it becomes clear that the majority of the Democratic Party is siding with the elite Southern enslavers, which a lot of Northerners don't care about. They don't care about Black rights. They don't care about human enslavement. But what they don't want is the government to be beholden to a very few, very rich people. And when that happens, Northerners vote Democrats out of office in droves in the elections of 1855 and 1856. And this actually, I'm going to play this out a little bit before I go to the late 19th century. It's worth thinking about what that means. If the districts that are kind of what we would call purple districts are really mad enough, they get rid of the people that they think are working for the very wealthy, or a group that people don't like. But the place that remains in the hands of those people tend to be I've lost the plural of the verb at this point. They tend to be quite extreme districts. So what happened in 1855, 1856 in the Northern Democrats is that the moderate districts all just threw out their Democrats and turned to the rising Republican Party. But the extremist districts went more extreme than ever. So this is how you're going to end up during the Civil War, with mostly war Democrats in the North, and that's a really broad brush. But the Democrats who remain in the North, like Clement Vallandigham, for example, those of you from Ohio probably have heard of him. Or if you were in 8th grade and had to read that story, The Man Without a Country, that was about Clement Vallandigham, which again, someday I'll tell you more about Clement Vallandigham, who died in a very interesting way. But he was really extreme. And Sunset Cox, another Ohio guy, Samuel S. Cox, known as Sunset, they were much more, they were kind of out of step with the rest of the North because they were in these extreme districts. And this is how you're going to get the idea of the Copperheads in the North. And they get their name from the fact that somebody tried to mail a couple of Copperhead snakes to Lincoln, and the package breaks open, and, but they become known as sort of the enemy within, if you will, the Copperheads. Anyway, that's worth paying attention to, because I think we're going to see the same thing, or we are seeing the same thing in this moment, where the districts that are frustrated with MAGA will stop electing MAGA and will turn to other candidates, and they're not necessarily Democratic candidates, but other candidates, and they will. So you'll end up with a much more homogeneous group of lawmakers in those districts. But the ones that are, Republican plus 17 will double down on real extreme people, and that's going to be very problematic. All right, so what is going on with, if I am identifying this uneasiness among elected lawmakers in the Republican Party right now, what is the larger story of the Republican Party and why it's in trouble right now? And honestly, I just think this is so fascinating. And I'm sorry when I do that. Remember, this is what I study, so it is intellectually interesting to me. Living through it isn't great, I gotta say, but 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 intellectually, think about what's going on here. You have had in the Republican Party since the 1980s, and really taking off in the 1990s, a fairly uneasy marriage between the at the time establishment Republicans who wanted the government to work to concentrate wealth among a very few people, and there was an ideological argument behind that. But they want to slash the safety net, the social safety net, and they hate the Affordable Care Act. They want to get rid of social welfare programs, and so on. They managed to stick together with the extremist traditionalist religious people, the traditionalist evangelicals, especially white evangelicals, with racists, with sexists, with those sort of cultural extremes. And they managed to convince a lot of Americans that the reason things weren't going well for them was because of the Democrats, because the Democrats, in their parlance, in what they said, was that the Democrats were taking tax dollars and wasting them on people of color, on women who wanted abortions, on waste, fraud, and abuse. That they were really taking tax dollars and throwing them away, basically. And that rhetoric was really powerful. And it was really powerful, not least because the radical right managed to put together a group of media figures, especially on talk radio, but then the Fox News channel and other channels as well, really, really push that narrative. So if you listen to, for example, Rush Limbaugh, and he would talk about femin Nazis, and this whole idea that women who wanted equal pay for equal work were somehow associated with Nazism. I mean, it's really extreme stuff, and it got more and more extreme as the economy for ordinary Americans got worse and worse. So they were able to do that, and they were able to get away from that, and get away with that, and continue to win elections based on that. Especially when voter suppression began to kick in after 1998 in places like Florida. But the thing that's happened under the Trump administration, that was really falling apart by 2016, when, if you remember, and most people have, memory hold this, but in 2016, Trump was really appeared to be the most moderate, economically the most moderate Republican running for the presidency. He talked about fairer taxes. He talked about, fixing healthcare. He talked about all these wonderful things he was going to do for ordinary Americans. Now, of course, he didn't do any of it. But if you listen to the way he talked, he sounded like he was going to try and fix this system for ordinary Americans. Now, and then he gets in office, and I'm not going to go through the whole first term because I want to get to the second term. But one of the things that's happened during the second term is the ability of the Project 2025 to put its wish list into effect. And it's an extremist wish list. Getting rid of U.S. aid, for example, the things that they have done, the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency made early on in the administration, what it did, I think, is that it stripped away the cover over that rhetoric. It was always rhetoric. I mean, the since 1980, I keep saying this, more than $50 trillion has moved from the bottom 50% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans. And that was the case because of supply side economics, which is what the Republicans put in place in the 1980s, and really kept pushing, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And the Democrats sort of went along with it because they sort of figured they had to work within these confines when people kept screaming about taxes. You can argue about whether or not that was the right decision, but it was sort of the way people thought about the government right then, and that's what they did. Um, but but under Trump in the second term, and first of all, Joe Biden comes in 2021, and he completely turns that on his head. He gets rid of supply side economics. He tries to rebuild the social safety net. He tries to really work with foreign countries. He really tries to put in place an older pre-1980 version of the American government. Well, the first thing Trump does, of course, is to overturn everything that Biden had done. But one of the interesting things about that was his attacks on the public sector and on the policies that Americans have grown to expect has woken a lot of people up. I remember for years talking about the idea that the Republicans were trying to get rid or trying to privatize Social Security and make cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. And I cannot count how many times people said, you are fear mongering. That's not what they want to do. They're never going to do it. And of course, I would say, but look, the bills they're introducing. Look at they're only backing off because the Democrats are fighting so hard or whatever. And the people were like, "No, you're just fear mongering." And you can remember in the 2024 election when Kamala Harris said things like that, the news media said, here we go, we're fear mongering again. Well, what Trump and especially Russell Vought of the Office of Management and Budget, who is busily putting Project 2025 into place, but also Elon Musk when he was at the Department of Government Efficiency, and certainly Stephen Miller, who is a white nationalist, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. What they have done is that they have stripped the veneer off that rhetoric. And a lot of people who had a lot to say about, the people they thought should not be getting government aid have suddenly discovered that the people who were getting government aid was them. So, the cutting of the U.S. aid hammered American farmers, and the tariffs have really destroyed the American soybean markets. And the cuts to Medicaid haven't even kicked in yet, but the cuts to the premium tax credits that underpin the Affordable Care Act premiums for a certain range of people. Those things are really, really, really biting. At the same time that if inflation's going up, I mean, Trump can say all he wants that it's not, but it is. I mean, I just don't even need to belabor that any longer. You've all been to the grocery store, things are more expensive. And inflation was coming down. It was almost back to the point that the Fed wanted it at the end of Biden's term, and now it's going back up again. So Americans are really getting squeezed at the same time that we're watching, the Great Gatsby party, and we're watching, the crypto scams, and we're watching the deals that the Trump administration is self-dealing. And people are suddenly, it seems to me, or maybe not so suddenly, recognizing that rhetoric has been extraordinarily self-serving for a very small group of Americans. And what that means politically then is that a lot of people are putting pressure not just on the Republican Party, but also on the Democratic Party. And one of the things, I did an interview with somebody and they said, the Democrats really won in November, the beginning of November. And my answer was, I don't think it was the Democrats. I think it was the American people. Because what we're seeing, I think, is a great broadening of the American electorate. That is, of people who suddenly are waking up and saying, I need to pay attention to this. I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to lose my health care. And when the vast majority of those people who did not vote in 2024, for example, or who thought that they were just voting for a political party like they were voting for a sports team, or who liked the way Trump sounded because they didn't really know what these policies meant, they're now paying attention and they're not liking what they're seeing. And when that has happened before in the 1850s and in the 1890s and again in the late 1920s, you see a major realignment of the country. And so when I look at the Republicans right now, I'm not just looking at the Republicans, I'm also looking at the Democrats, because the Democrats are changing too. And they're both changing to more accurately reflect the American people, because the American people are finally speaking up again. And they haven't been for a long time. And you're starting to see more and more people taking a stand in public about what they think the government should do. And this is fascinating. So I did an interview recently with Jim Himes, a representative from Connecticut. And one of his big things is that we really need to reinforce the War Powers Act so that Trump can't do whatever he wants. But he also went on to say, listen, what Trump is doing, attacking civilians, is completely off the charts. But then he said, but I wasn't real keen on Clinton and Obama attacking military targets in a similar sort of way, and they did end up deferring to Congress, but they went off on their own. And what he said about that was really interesting. He's a Democrat. He said Congress has got to stand up again for its constitutional duties and powers. And yeah, so you're seeing a lot of sort of things added to the mix, and people wanting to stand up and represent the American people. And what will come out of that, I don't think we know what the parties will look like, but I will tell you the fact that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other Republicans are backing away suggests that there's a real problem in the Republican Party, and we know that because MAGA has increasingly moved toward the not neo-Nazis, toward the Nazis, right? They're moving that direction. They're moving toward really the embrace of the extremists who are openly racist and sexist and anti-Semitic and openly admire Adolf Hitler. And as they do that, they're losing supporters. Americans don't like Nazis in general. And that is very problematic for them. But then there is also the fact that Americans really don't like this whole Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, those tech bro, that tech bro oligarchy, if you will, broligarchy, I guess people are calling it, that pretty openly says that they think they should rule everything. And, a lot of you asked about Rockbridge, which actually, if you're interested, I wrote about it more than a week ago, I think. It's a group of very wealthy investors, I said, but I meant to say donors, but investors works too, who credit themselves with putting J.D. Vance into the vice presidency because they really believe, as their leader says, that the United States should have an aristocracy. And the reason I wrote about it the other night was because, I guess it was last weekend, was because you could superimpose that language directly on the 1920s, the era of the robber barons in the 1890s, and in the period of the elite Southern enslavers in the 1850s. The idea that they really should run everything. And they, in both periods, that's the exact same language. So as this happens, you're going to see a lot of political changes. Now, one of the things that people always ask about is, what about a third party? And third parties are hard in the United States now for many reasons, not least because the infrastructure for a country that has as many people in it as we do is difficult to rebuild. I'm not saying it's impossible. Certainly on the Republican side, Trump has so corrupted their infrastructure that maybe it would be better to start from scratch again. But what more typically happens in the United States since the 1850s is the political parties keep the same name, but they rebrand themselves pretty dramatically. And we saw that in the 1890s when the Republican Party goes from being the robber barons to being progressive. They still called themselves the Republicans, but they were really very different generationally. And you see the same thing repeatedly with the Democrats as well. The Democrats rebrand in the same time in that period as well. So more typically, you've got the parties changing who they are really dramatically and keeping the name. And I think you can see that happening in certainly on the Democratic side now. It's really quite interesting to see. Now, somebody asked, now I'm remembering one of the other things that I left on that notebook page. Somebody asked, why do those super rich people think that they should control the rest of us? And I don't know the answer to that, obviously, but I will tell you that there's something I observed in the late 1890s. And that's that coming out of the Civil War, the Southern enslavers who had run the American South before the war, I keep calling them the elite Southern enslavers because, in fact, most white American Southerners who held their neighbors in bondage held one person, maybe two, worked in the fields alongside them. And that's the majority by far of enslavement. But a few enslavers, and that's why I say elite Southern enslavers, had huge gangs of people that they enslaved, and they were the ones who were really running everything. So after the war, what you see is those big names, the people, the Wade Hamptons, and the really big enslavers, the ones who had run politics before the war, they turn against the idea of Black rights in 1871. I've talked about this a lot. And instead of talking about race any longer, which is still uppermost in their minds, make no mistake, these are the same people, but their language changes really quickly after the establishment of the Department of Justice in 1870, because the Department of Justice starts to arrest and try and convict KKK members who attack their Black neighbors based on race. That's in 1870. So in 1871, these elite Southern enslavers say, hey, we have no problem at all with race. Just, again, there's a really dramatic break in the way they talk about things. What we don't want poor people to vote, because they will vote for roads and schools and hospitals that can only be paid for through tax dollars, and we're the only ones who own any property. So this is a redistribution of wealth. It is a form of socialism. And they talk that way in 1870, and then it takes off again in 1874. But when they talk about Black American men primarily, because of course women aren't voting, they talk about them and they denigrate them as being uneducated and poor and coming out of enslavement when it was illegal for them to have educations. That's not a far stretch initially to say that they're uneducated. They talk about things that way, and they talk about the idea of making sure that politics is not corrupted. And that means like that doesn't mean suitcases of money in that period so much as it means corrupting the body politic like a disease. And they talk about politics that way, and they say things like that about Black voters, Black male voters. But it's pretty clearly rhetoric for them. That is, they can't talk about race, so they've got this political construct. But what's really interesting is in the 1880s, when their sons come of age, they actually believe it. This is the world they've grown up in. They believe that Black Americans, men, I'm sorry, I should keep saying that, should never vote, and that they are dangerous to society. And they really believe it. And you see the lynching, which has really fallen off in the 1880s, goes off the charts in 1889 when Republicans talk about protecting Black voting again. And that's when you start to see the lynching parties and so on. And the reason I'm laying all this out is you asked why people seem to want more. And what I felt like I saw between one generation and the other in the American South in that period among this group of elite white men was the political rhetoric of one generation is internalized by the next generation. They really believe they're better than the people around them. And the reason I lay that out is because when you think about some of the people like, and I'm going to pick on Don Jr. here, Donald Trump Jr., when he talks about teachers, for example, which is how he got a burr under my saddle, and he talks about, he really denigrates people as if he's so much better than them. And to me, that's the face of somebody who has never had to work a day in their lives, that somehow they have decided they're better than the rest of us because that's what the world they grew up in. And at the times when he would really denigrate teachers, I used to just sit there and say, give that man 4 hours in a fourth grade classroom, because he has no concept of what real work is, and that there's just that going on. So that's maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, but you did ask me why they feel that way, and I wonder if it's a generational change, because they have internalized what was political rhetoric in the 1980s is now their reality, even though it is utterly divorced, or their fantasy, even though it is utterly divorced from actual reality. And I think you can see this. I'm going to go back to the party crumbling for a second, in just how bad this Department of Justice is. Could they have screwed up the Comey case any more than they did? And, speaking of which, when they talk about, they have this justification for these military strikes on the people driving the boats in Venezuela. It's like, if you couldn't even manage an indictment here in the US, why should we believe anything you have to say about Venezuela? And you look at all the many ways in which they're extraordinarily incompetent, and you recognize that their own vision of how competent they are is in really serious contention with just how bad they are at the work that they're doing. All right, so the other piece I think that you can see, the Republicans in real trouble, is in the fact that the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans are fighting. The fact that the House Republicans are enormously frustrated with Mike Johnson, who seems to be losing power by the day. But one of the other things that is, to me, is really interesting was this whole thing over the weekend with and into last week with this 28-point plan, theoretically, for peace between Russia and Ukraine. And it's very clear that people were freelancing, that you had on the one side, you had Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who was apparently not aware that Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, apparently with the help of Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and the support of J.D. Vance, were freelancing to essentially give the Russians whatever they wanted. And Marco Rubio tried to stand against it, and he talked to the senators, and it went back and forth and back and forth. And it was, first of all, it was incredibly embarrassing. It was clear that that foreign policy was whichever group thought it was that day. But you asked about this today, and I think this is an important sign. News broke today, I believe it was in Bloomberg, but has been picked up elsewhere now, that Steve Witkoff apparently advised the Russians on how to approach Trump, and there has been a leaked telephone recording. Now, that whole story itself is bad enough, but someone leaked it. Always look and see when there are leaks, because that says somebody's unhappy and they're going to the media about it. And that was a pretty important leak. So that's another sign that the Republican Party, the wheels seem to be coming off the bus. That being said, that does not mean it's not going to be a mess going forward. It's probably going to be worse than ever going forward. But that does raise the question, and now I'm killing myself because I had a great ending over at the house. Sorry about that. That it does raise the question, as somebody said, how on earth are we going to make it through 3 years of this, 3 more years of this? What do we see as getting Trump out of office? And the answer is, well, first of all, we don't know. Again, that's the future. But second of all, the thing that has made the difference in the last year, since January, in the United States of America, is us. It is the American people putting pressure on their elected officers to say, we don't like what's going on. We want to have navigational buoys. We want to have affordable health care. We want to have all of these many things that we thought were written into our laws and wouldn't be changed. And we are now discovering that the MAGA Republicans are stripping them away from us, and we want them back. And that pressure, the marches, the organization, the raising money, the running for office, especially at the local level with school boards, for example, and town halls. That is what is taking somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene and having her look around and say, if I want to get reelected, my bet shouldn't be on MAGA. It should be on the issues that ordinary Americans care about. And again, if you look at those, we are overwhelmingly in favor of FEMA. We like FEMA. We like USAID. We like education. We like clean water. We like clean air. We don't like unregulated AI. All the positions that people are now calling progressive, I find fascinating, because if that's the case, then we are an extraordinarily progressive country, because 70 to 80% of us, 85% on some of these things, want those issues. And so if I keep saying, if we stop thinking about the world as us versus them, like Trump wants us to, or even as Republicans versus Democrats, as the political punditry seems to be doing, and think of ourselves as Americans versus a very small group of oligarchs and MAGA who are trying to force us to live in sort of this hellscape. If we think about it that way, our political alliances change in a hurry. We bleed off the MAGAs, who are the neo-Nazis, and we bleed off the Peter Thiels and the Broligarchs, and then we have the rest of us to enforce what we want through a democracy. That's what we've done. That's what we did in the 1850s, we did in the 1890s, did in the 1930s. It certainly looks like that's what we're doing now. Now, that being said, don't think for a minute it's going to be easy. The people who are in power are not going to give up that power easily. And they're going to get worse the more they think that their power is in jeopardy. And you can see that around us now with the attacks on Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, for the idea that he needs to be court-martialed for making a video that actually calls for members in the service members to remember that it is the law for them to disobey unlawful orders. And somehow the Trump administration has turned that around to say that by suggesting, I actually spent hours on this yesterday, so I finally figured out how it works. They are saying, and by the way, the video that they produced, I think it was last Tuesday, is very clear. You must not obey unlawful orders. They say that. But what the administration has turned that into is, by saying that, they are saying that Trump has given unlawful orders, which, by the way, it appears he might have in Venezuela at the least. And by saying that Trump has given unlawful orders, they are, according to the Trump administration, saying that it's very convoluted. They are saying that service members should not follow the chain of command, and therefore they are committing treason, which is completely bass-backwards. It's completely not what they said at all. But that attempt to go after a sitting senator because he exercised his right to free speech, and for that matter, his prerogatives under the Speech and Debate Clause of the Constitution, which permits members of Congress to speak freely about legislative issues, not about everything, but about legislative issues anywhere, is a sign, I think, of this increasing desperation and the increasing desire to hurt people and to try and gather as much power into their hands as they possibly can. So it's not going to be easy, but the momentum is very much on the side of those of us who are trying to defend our democracy. And once again, that is not a partisan position. You can be part of this movement if you're an independent, if you're a Republican. Right now, though, the people who are really embracing democracy and trying to protect our country are the Democrats. And that's where my weight is right now, behind them, because they're the ones who are out there in front doing these, trying to protect the country. So we're in a funny time. And, I wake up every morning and say to my husband, I just feel like we're reliving the 1890s. And if you remember the 1890s, they were not calm times, but many of the signs that we see around us look very much like that. And the key going forward is to keep that pressure up, keep swinging, keep staying in the game, because we need to keep that momentum up and going. Thank you all for being here this morning. And I am thrilled today to be talking to Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, who has represented Virginia in Congress since 2009, and who has in that time often been either the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee or the ranking member. And you remember the ranking member means the top member on the committee from the opposite party than the one that is in control of the Senate. So thank you very much for being here today, Senator Warner. I'm really excited to hear about what you do on that Senate committee.
Well, Heather, thank you for having me, and I appreciate your great work and have followed it very closely over the last couple of years. The Senate Intelligence Committee came about in the mid-1970s. In many ways, America, while we had an intelligence agents all the way back to George Washington, we really didn't have a formal separated service until after World War II. And that was with the Central Intelligence Agency. I think anybody who's followed history realizes the CIA, while they had some successes, they had a lot of failures as well. And there was virtually no oversight from Congress of the CIA. In 1975, roughly, there was something called the Church Committee. They'd seen some of the excesses, and they created two standing committees, one in the House, one in the Senate. And what's unique about the Intelligence Committee is, in many ways, we are the only members in the Senate, there are now 17 of us, that get to see classified information. And then there's even a more select subset that is the chair and vice chair that get to see what's called the Gang of Eight material, things that, supposed to see everything basically the president gets to see. So those committees were set up, and our job is to, frankly, be the eyes and the ears for other members who are not on the committee. After 9/11, when there was such an intelligence failure, there was an attempt in our Intelligence Committee grew from one agency, literally, we're now at, I think, 18, 19, I sometimes get it mixed up because you've got every military service has got an intelligence agency. We've got satellite services. We've got, the people that listen in, the National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency. Space Force now has a intelligence component. We said we need to have a better organization. We correct the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI. That has been of mixed success in terms of trying to coordinate and make sure that we share information appropriately. I had very little background. I was a business guy. I was governor. I was more a numbers nerd, but I got on the intelligence community very early on after I was elected, and it's really become my greatest passion in public service, because not only do we get to look at all the national security issues from how we share information, get information about our adversaries, but in many ways the Intelligence Committee has also become, at least in the Senate, the default technology committee, because as we look particularly in terms of competition with China, around artificial intelligence, quantum computing, AI and bio combined. I was a wireless guy, so the rise of Huawei. National security is more than tanks and guns. It is also technology competition, and we're the entity that really follows a lot of that. And it isn't. It's been frightening at times. It's never dull, and for the most part, particularly until the beginning of this second Trump administration, it has been uniformly bipartisan. Some of that has fallen aside recently, which is really, really disappointing. But it is the one place, because there's not a lot of grandstanding. We go into what's called a SCIF, a secure place. We don't have press, and for the most part, once we have witnesses, you can't tell who's a Democrat and who's a Republican. That's a good thing.
So, can you walk us through a little bit what it looks like to be on the Senate Intelligence Committee? That is, how often do you meet? How do you get information? When do you know something big is going on? When do you feel like you are being shut out of information? What does it look like, literally, to be on the Senate Intelligence Committee? And while you're at it, can you explain to people what the Gang of Eight is? Because you see Gang of Eight all the time, what the Gang of Eight is, and again, how the Gang of Eight gets alerted to something extraordinary that the rest of the Intelligence Committee will not necessarily be let in on.
Yeah, very good question. We will have 2 to 3 meetings a week, and the chair and the vice chair, usually the chair sets most of the agenda. We'll have oversight responsibilities that each of the multiple intelligence agencies have to come before us and make their case for financing. They will brief us on state of the world and by their domain, either by geographic domain or if it's satellite. And then I will spend on top of that, because literally dozens of hours a week, not in formal meetings where I'm getting direct briefings or reaching out. Again, my particularly interest is around technology competition with China. The Gang of Eight was set up because there are certain things that are so sensitive that an administration says we don't even want to share that with the whole intelligence committees in the House and the Senate. And the Gang of Eight includes the Speaker and the Minority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, Minority Leader, and then the 4 key people from the House Intelligence Committee, chairs and ranking members of the House and the Senate. And that is supposed to be the group, if the president is going to do for example, a bombing of Iran, we're supposed to be notified first in terms of congressional delegation. One of the things that's very concerning to me right now is, we've had no real briefing on Venezuela. And if the president is planning on action there, it is not just tradition, but it's the law that we're supposed to be kept informed. Uniquely enough, the Gang of Eight during the second Trump administration has not been, there have been a number of times where I think there have been major fouls in terms of how information has been briefed, or it's just briefed to one party. The first Trump administration was actually quite good at keeping Congress informed. It is a night and day experience between Trump 1 and Trump 2.
So before we get into that, I'd like you to go back just for a second and talk about how many different intelligence components there are to the U.S. government, because that became very clear, I think, when President Trump was charged with retaining classified documents, and the number of agencies that were had some of their information compromised was really astonishing. And you have mentioned the people who look at satellite imagery, for example, as being different than the CIA. I don't remember how many agencies there are, but I think that's worth emphasizing for people, that we have a very large intelligence community. And then talking perhaps a little bit about why. Why does it matter that we have this intelligence?
Well, we have 18 different agencies inside the federal government that are intelligence agencies. The original, well, actually the original came out of the State Department. But we have the CIA, which most people are familiar with. CIA is supposed to be doing human intelligence, the act of spying, espionage. They also create the gadgets. If you're a James Bond fan, there are those equivalents. We have intelligence components of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. We have, in terms of satellites, we have one organization, National Reconnaissance Organization, that basically puts the satellites, either launches them or uses commercial satellites for the overhead spying. Then we have something called the NGA, the National Geospatial Agency, that literally takes the pixels and tries to analyze them. So you don't want to make sure that the satellites are, capturing and analyzing all the information. So you've got a different entity there. You have the National Security Agency, which is where we've had breaches in the past, where you have listening in. And again, this goes to the heart of a series of protections, so that our government can't listen in on American domestic conversations, but can listen in oftentimes on foreign conversations if there is identified targets. We have the FBI that has components that does domestic, but also have some components in terms of how our foreign intelligence intersects with domestic intelligence. Remember, it was the CIA and the FBI that didn't share intelligence enough that many people said led to 9/11, because we had, following the terrorists, when they came to America, the FBI was supposed to pick up and people didn't share. We have the State Department, for example, has an intelligence component. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which is separate from the intelligence agencies of the individual services, are the folks who are like oftentimes the military attaches at embassies that also have an intelligence function. We then, I've not named them all right now, Space Force, the Energy Department has a component because of the challenge around nuclear weapons. But the big ones are the CIA, the NSA, the NRO and NGA combined, and FBI, and then Defense Intelligence Agencies, the big 5 or 6. What was interesting with the Director of National Intelligence, we said we weren't sharing enough, so this office was created, and it was supposed to kind of coordinate. It doesn't have direct budgetary control over all of these entities, but it is supposed to be the coordinating body. And depending on who's been the head of the Director of National Intelligence, it really is as much a convener and a personality driven, because if an agency doesn't do what the ODNI says, the ODNI director doesn't have any ability to kind of cut off the money. So it's an imperfect solution, but it's much, much better than it was 20 years ago. So that's the structure.
So why? Why do we need all this? And where I'm really going with this is the sense that one gets from this administration that protecting the country is about big bangs, when the history of our country suggests that, in fact, nothing is more important than alliances and information. Am I right in that?
Amen. You are so right. And we have the 3 biggest services in the world are the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians. And we are, I think, still the best, but we are the best not only because the men and women who serve, but because we have strong alliances. We have our tightest alliances are with the other English-speaking democracies in the world, the British, the Australians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders. They're called the Five Eye partners. And, we share very easily. We have lesser sharing relationships with a lot of our NATO partners. We have strong, obviously, ties with Israel. But we get a lot of information from, African country services, other Asian country services, and that helps us. And why we have so many of these different agencies is you don't want to simply trust one source. You really do need, there is duplication here on purpose in many ways, because if you simply rely on a CIA agent's tip, you could get yourself in harm's way. So we often ask for the analysis of not only the human intelligence, but what's called overhead, the oftentimes spying from the sky, and the signals intelligence, which is what the NSA does. And that is all, again, supplemented with our allies' input. And those relationships, that most of them with our allies, are based upon trust, not based upon some legally binding obligation. And one of the things that's been so troublesome with the Trump administration is the kind of disrespect of our allies. The fact that the president's been so disrespectful for Canada, towards Canada, and of all countries, Canada, to the point of saying at some point Canada maybe shouldn't be in the Five Eyes. That's ridiculous. It's insane. And the job of the intelligence community at the end of the day is not the big bang, as you indicated, Heather. It really is to keep policymakers, starting with the president, but also the Congress, and also our military leadership, informed. We're all the customers of the intelligence community, so that we can have the best insights into what policy actions we should take. And the last point, and this is probably the most important, is that the intelligence community has to be willing to speak truth to power. Because if the intelligence community is politicized or cooking the books, that could lead to wars like what happened in Iraq, where I'm not saying there was the community itself, but it feels like the policymakers manipulated some of that information and didn't press hard enough. And probably my overarching greatest fear from the Trump administration is that they are undermining that intelligence. We've seen time and again intelligence professionals fired because they wouldn't create a product that fit the president's narrative. That makes us less safe, and it has actually led, and some of this I can talk about, to a number of companies publicly saying they're not sure they're willing to share as much information because they're not sure it'll be kept secret. And they, frankly, in certain cases, have questions about what our goals are, particularly vis-a-vis Russia.
So let's get into that. But I want to pick up something you just said right there, and that is keep us safer. That at the end of the day, the whole point of intelligence is to keep Americans safe,
Yeah.
and that our alliances and our intelligence are really the first line of defense between us and cyber attacks, terrorist attacks, even wars. And that, sometimes I think we forget that when we think about spying, that it's really an attempt to make sure we have the right information to keep this country safe. But so you alluded to
Can I add one other just quick addendum to that? And this has been hard for the intelligence community, I think, to fully move. Traditionally, the way you spy on another country is you spy on their government, you spy on their military. Increasingly, if you accept my premise that national security is also about who's going to win the AI race, who's going to crack quantum computing, who's going to have the most advanced telecommunication systems and all of these technology domains. Because with China, with Russia, we had a military adversary and a ideological adversary. With China, we have a country that is investing at the levels that we used to invest. So we've been trying to move this giant apparatus to say, we also need to figure out and know about, the Chinese AI model DeepSeek that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. We totally got caught off guard, and particularly in my old area of expertise in telecom, when suddenly this company Huawei caught everybody's attention, and we had no idea how quickly and fast it was coming. So moving the enterprise to also look at technology competition, we just have not done that well, but we're getting better.
Well, and that leads to the point that when we think about spying, it's not spy versus spy the way it used to be in Mad Magazine, but in fact, it's gathering intelligence through relationships and through real scientific techniques and technology and so on. It's a very different world, it seems.
Yes, it is.
So you have spoken a couple of times now on the floor of the Senate about your concerns about the intelligence community under this second Trump administration. Can you explain to us what's happening and why we should be concerned?
Well, what's happening is, I thought the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was totally unequipped to be the Director of National Intelligence. I led an effort. We came very close to defeating her, because she is a rabid partisan, and she's been a rabid partisan on she was a liberal Democrat, and then she's a MAGA person. She has, I would say unusual ties with Russia in terms of the Russian government is constantly, complimenting her. We had that initially. Then we saw, in the early days, people being fired that were young CIA agents, and it takes a couple $100,000 to train as CIA agents, and firing those folks, I think, slowed down the human capital input. We've seen early on in the administration senior leaders fired because when they were trying to do an investigation into some of the gangs in Venezuela and their ties to the Maduro government, and Maduro in Venezuela is a bad guy, let's acknowledge that. But they didn't come up with the conclusion that the administration wanted, and they got fired for that. And we've seen people who are undercover have their identities carelessly identified, which puts them in harm's way. And then this kind of evisceration and of the intelligence community really picked up steam in the summer when uniformed military officers, like the head of the National Security Agency, which is both NSA and Cyber Command, got fired for no reason at all, other than this right-wing zealot, Laura Loomer, didn't like him, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who made the assessment of the Iran bombing saying, it was very powerful, but he wouldn't use the words obliterated, which it was not obliterated, and we know that now, and he got fired for that. And we've seen, at the FBI, enormous loss of all of our, career top officials because they oftentimes wouldn't bend the knee. And all of these actions combined make us, one, less secure, two, makes our intelligence partners around the world really concerned about what the hell's going on here. This has never happened at this level before. And then, three, I'll cite the FBI for an example. When you take, in some field offices, up to 45% of the agents who are doing counterterrorism or doing cyber or even doing sexual exploitation crimes, and take them off those missions and stick them on immigration raids, that doesn't make any sense. And we hear back that, gosh, we need to get back to these active cases we're working on, and instead we're just extra bodies on immigration raids. So you put this all together, and I could, in my speeches on the floor of the Senate, have cited much more chapter and verse on this. And I'm, trying not to be over the top partisan, but just saying this is not making America safer. And you have seen from the president, as far back in this case to his first term, where he stood by Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, Finland, and basically agreed with the Russian president and threw our intelligence community under the bus. That kind of disdain for an independent intelligence community has been really reflected in the president's comments, in Gabbard's comments, in Secretary Hegseth's comments from the DOD side, and it's dangerous as hell.
So I want to get into why it's dangerous. But first, can you say a little bit more about what this has done to the intelligence sharing among people with whom we used to share intelligence, and what they have done, including, and I'm going to lead into this, the fact that Colombia is no longer sharing its information with us about drug interdictions?
Well, let's start with Colombia. Colombia was, frankly, one of our greatest successes, and a lot of that goes to President Bush. It was called Plan Colombia, where we worked with the Colombian government to try to, one, help them assist in their civil war against the FARC, but most importantly, to go after the drug gangs. And we were successful. And progress. Colombia's not perfect by any means. Colombia elected a more left-wing president. Relations got worse, but they still were intelligence sharing until the president's starting to take these actions about not only threatening Venezuela, but attacking the drug boats. And again, remember, most of the drugs we're talking about still originate in Colombia or Ecuador. They don't originate in Venezuela. It is mostly all cocaine. It is not fentanyl. So that hurts us. But what is even more troubling to me is that when our strongest ally, the British, and the British punch much above their weight in terms of their intelligence gathering. They have operations in countries like Iran where they've got diplomatic relations that we don't. And in the kind of legacy of their intelligence community goes back hundreds of years. When they have said publicly they're not sure they're going to share as much because they're concerned about our actions in the Caribbean. That just doesn't happen unless they're really worried. Even earlier than that, the Dutch, who again have a very good service, first said it in the Dutch press, and now more recently have said it in the public press. They're concerned about sharing it. And I've had some of our top other partners come in, and I get to know the heads of these agencies, and they say, Mark, in a sense, what the hell's going on here? Because they're afraid that if they share a source and we don't keep that secret, that source could be exposed, oftentimes then killed, and that hurts their country as well as it hurts us. So it is really, really problematic here. And then you take that and you think about second and third world countries where the president basically taking down all of America's soft power, where we provide small but in some cases overall important humanitarian assistance from USAID. When all of that is taken away, then in those countries they're not willing to share as much as well. So, and what we've done is, the one thing we always had, it was that as sometimes we screw up and we've made mistakes, but at the end of the day, most of the world viewed us as still kind of the good guys with all our flaws. China and Russia didn't have allies in a real sense. They had countries they could dominate or they paid off, but but not real allies. The thing that is so disturbing to me, and this particularly in parts of Asia and parts of Africa in particular, but also South America, where it's now looking like China could be a more dependable, long-term, consistent partner than the United States. That is bad for our security. It's bad for our economy. And that has been exacerbated by, the president's over-the-top comments. It's been exacerbated by, kind of requiring the intelligence or wanting the intelligence community to produce products that meets his political narrative, even if that narrative is not true.
So I want to push on that just a little bit, because you have spoken about the politicization of intelligence under the second Trump administration, not as a partisan problem so much as an intelligence problem. And what you're really seeing and what you've really described is the replacement of a nonpartisan service that tries to give the best possible intelligence to one that is partisan.
Well, let me interrupt you there. I don't. I'm pretty frustrated with my Republican friends. I wouldn't call this a partisan, making our intelligence community partisan. I would making it, try to be loyal to meet the Trump narrative. I think that is different than a Republican partisan. And it's one of the things that's, I keep making that case, but my case gets weaker all the time when the Republicans don't stand up and push back. But I don't think it's an effort to try to say we want to be a classic Republican-driven intelligence community, more a Trump agenda.
Okay, that's an important distinction, and one I often make too, that there is the traditional concept of a Republican Party, and then there is Trumpism. But what you're talking about is creating an intelligence service that serves this particular administration and has fired people and is making it uncomfortable for people to offer information that doesn't meet that narrative and so on. So what I really want to ask you about is why somebody would do that. And that's where I'm going with that is I was fascinated by a speech that former FBI Director Robert Mueller gave in New York City in 2011, in which he talked about the emerging, what did he call it? The emerging threat, the emerging terrorist threat in the new modern 21st century. And what he argued was that what America really has to grapple with in this era is transnational organizations that are not ideological, that are not necessarily religious, but they are essentially organized crime that mixes together businesses, governments, and terrorists, essentially to amass money, but also power. And I thought that was really interesting when I was reading your speech, I think it was of September, and you talked about this pushback against the constant pushback against the Russia investigation from President Trump. Because as you pointed out, it is the only report from the Senate Intelligence Committee, I believe, that was unanimously accepted by the people on that committee, including then at the time chair of the committee, Marco Rubio. So, is that what we're looking at here? An attempt to loosen the guardrails for cyber criminals, for example, for different kinds of crime across the world? Or is this just, I'm breaking it because I want to?
Well, I think it may be a little bit of both. And let me answer your question, but let me set a bit of a preface. This is not just happening with the intelligence community. This is happening across all of our government. The Federal Reserve was set up to be independent of the president. The president is trying to bring the Federal Reserve and who sets interest rates under his control. We have all of the independent regulatory agencies that whoever the party in power is gets to have the majority. Think the SEC, think the commodities, CFTC, think about a host, the FCC as well, FTC, all these, three-letter.
It's good to say.
That
alphabet stuff.
Yeah, that's too important stuff. But they're supposed to have whoever's the president gets the majority on the commission. The minority party gets, they're usually split 3-2 or ratios like that. This president has basically tried to say no, he doesn't have to adhere to the law on the role of those independent entities. So it's not just in the intelligence community that he's trying to get away from all of our traditional checks and balances, point one. In terms of Director Mueller comments. I think he was dead on. And let me give you some specific examples. In Russia, a number of the entities that are doing cyber crimes, they may work for the Russian intelligence services by day, but at night they're cyber criminals. So they're FSB, but then they may be also getting ransomware. Is that a nation state attacking us, or is that a criminal enterprise? That's even more so the case in China, where when we look at technology development, part of Chinese law requires that any company at the end of the day has to be first and foremost loyal to the CCP, not to their shareholders. So, and some of this again leads to corruption in the Chinese system, and there are then efforts by Americans to take advantage of that, not just from Trump, but this goes, I could talk forever on that subject. Then you've got the Trump administration, where it's the one thing you got to give him in terms of audaciousness, he does it in plain sight, where his kids are running around the world, cutting deals for the Trump organization, and then that country gets preferred treatment by the administration. Their leader gets a meeting with the American president. That used to be something that, was a high prestige. And we've got this, the kind of ultimate example of this, in recently, in terms of, on one hand, the president is saying we got to stop the narco terrorists and bomb these boats rather than interdicting them and showing the world that there's drugs and bad guys on the boats. And at the same time, somebody else appears to be paying off somebody to get the Honduran president, who is convicted in American courts of being a massive drug runner, gets him a pardon. I mean, this is really, Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole in a way where our friends, our allies around the world are scratching their head. Now, back quickly to close out this part on the Russia investigation. There were so many dangling threads that we never could follow, where it appeared there might have been, much more inappropriate activity that potentially involved money. And we frankly presume that Bob Mueller, who then did his own investigation, because he was so well respected, but when he did his he didn't pursue any of those leads. So we don't know. I will say I'm still, one of the things I'm proudest of in my time in the Senate is that 4-volume, multi-thousand-page report that has every member from the most liberal to the most conservative all agreeing that these were the facts. And there was nobody that would doubt that Russia was interfering in our elections, whether they were doing that, whether there was knowledge from the Trump campaign. We didn't reach a conclusion there, but the fact that they now have the director of national intelligence basically refuting everything that our intelligence community had found and saying this is all a Russia hoax, you talk about why people are losing faith in us. That's a prime example.
So just for people who are watching, if you're interested in those volumes, they are available online, and there are wonderful, very short summaries at the beginning of each of them. So you don't have to read the thousands and thousands of pages there. I think the summaries are about a page and a half to 2.5 pages. They're very clear, and they lay out what was happening. So if you want to look at them, you can see in the table of contents where those summaries are, and they're really quick, easy reads. So before I let you go, I don't feel like we can finish talking today without talking a little bit about what on earth is going on in the waters around Venezuela. And especially now, this new information that we appear to have that came out last night about a standing order that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth wrote. I know today you're about to go hear from Admiral Bradley, who was the person in charge of special operations that did that, apparently gave the order for the double tap strike on September 2nd. And what I'm really curious about is how much of any of this have the intelligence committees been apprised of? And if not, is there A, concern about that, but B, a plan to do something about it?
Well, one, in terms of the overall actions, it has been minimal at best. We've been briefed a couple of times. The decision was taken in late July to start these strikes. It's never been fully explained, and incredibly, 90% of the strikes are in the Caribbean. 95% of the cocaine is actually going through the Eastern Pacific. So if it was really about the drug flows, it wouldn't be where they're striking. And frankly, the point I keep making I know we've got some visibility and the drug cartels are awful and we ought to do all we can to go after them. But we'd be a hell of a lot better in terms of how we're viewed, not only in America, but around the world, if we said, well, let's stop these boats and show the world the drugs and show the world the bad guys on the boats, as opposed to blowing up. And you've got Hegseth, he's having a rough week because the inspector general said his earlier malfeasance around using signal chat personal phones with classified information put our troops in harm's way. That came out in the last 48 hours. And now we've got this evidence where Hegseth initially bragged about overseeing and commanding this whole strike on September 2nd. And now as the facts come out, he says, well, maybe he was not fully in command or he didn't issue. And I'm just hoping from Admiral Bradley that we'll hear the truth. And again, this could have been totally cleared up if they would have released the unedited video of the strike on day one. So this is really problematic. So let's break this quickly into the category of their actions against the drug cartels. And again, the drug cartels are, as Mueller would have said, they're not ideological. They're all about making money, but they're willing to, kill people and do awful things to make that money. That is a separate discussion from the question about Venezuela. And let me be clear, Maduro is a bad guy, and I am very critical of what the Biden administration didn't do when the Venezuelan people voted overwhelmingly, 65% plus, to throw out Maduro. Biden didn't put near enough pressure on Colombia, Brazil, Mexico to push him out, and we missed that opportunity. That doesn't then, though, give the president the ability to say, all right, we're going to close off their airspace, we're going to start bombing them. And since this has been in this slow build-up process for months, he's got no ability, without telling Congress what his plan is, to take these actions. There's nothing that's been approved. He's not even asked for authority. And the way you grant the president a little bit of grace if he has to act quickly is when it was the secret strike against Iran, where again they didn't brief the Democrats initially, they only briefed the Republicans, for when an adversary takes an action and you've got to act quickly. This has been a slow-moving buildup for months on end, and if the president would start striking Venezuela, he has no authority or approval from Congress or anyone else, and he's not even fully made the case.
Right. So the strikes themselves are already problematic, but then you also have now this apparent double tap strike, which even under their own justification is outside the bounds of that.
This may have been 4 strikes, not even just 2. Right. So we'll get more of that by end of the close of business today.
And so, is this of concern in the intelligence committees or
Absolutely.
In Congress in general?
It is the one time, I think, again, where we're starting to see my Republican friends, at least on the Armed Services Committee, say we got to investigate this. I hear, because a lot of the sailors who are down in the Caribbean right now are home ported out of Norfolk, Virginia.
Right.
So we get calls, literally my office gets calls from parents saying, my son or daughter down there potentially doing something that could get them in legal jeopardy if they're violating, the law of war, that you're not supposed to kill people that are non-combatants, that are clearly not, still a threat. And I can't answer those questions yet. And that is deeply concerning to me. And then on top of that, they've got questions saying, Venezuela has not got a huge military by any means, but are my kids going to be in harm's way if we strike Venezuela? And why are we doing that? And the president has not made the case other than that Maduro's a bad guy and 50 nations, including ours, don't recognize his government. But there's a lot of other bad guys and gals around the world that we don't send an aircraft carrier fleet down to strike.
So I'm going to let you go, but it's funny, as I'm listening to you talk, it all seems to me to boil down to that very simple adage, right? That knowledge is power. And the fact that the United States had access to such extraordinary knowledge through allies around the world, made us powerful. And now that you're operating in the dark, that we are operating in the dark, you can watch that power slipping away. I guess the question is, to whom is it slipping? And what does that mean for the American people at the end of the day?
Well, it means that we are not as informed, number one, as policymakers. Number two, it means that our allies have less faith in us. And number three, the job of the intelligence community is not to make a policy decision. It's not to decide strike Venezuela or not, or go after, drug runners or not. That's up to the elected officials or the folks in the administration to try to make the case. But their job is to tell the truth. And if analysts are bending the truth to try to meet the political desires of the president, then we're kind of screwed. And then all of that information gathering carries a political taint. And if the policymaker says, well, I'm not sure I trust this anymore, that makes Americans less safe. And they should be, whether they're supporters of the president or not, you got to have the willingness of the adage in the Intelligence Committee, speak truth to power. If that truth is being corrupted, America is less safe, and that should not happen.
If you were going to tell people one thing that they could do or something they could do to express their concern about this, what would you ask them to do?
I would ask them, one, to vote in next year's elections, because I think until we get some balance of power back in Congress, we're not going to be held accountable. And I would ask particularly if they're represented by, Republicans, to please try to talk to their senators and congressmen and say, even if they agree with the president on some of his policy items, in terms of our national security, there should be no partisan politics, or there should not even be, in partisan is, again, we get using the misword, there should be not Trumpism versus the traditional speaking truth to power.
Well, this has been a real pleasure, and I hope we can do it again. I would love to talk to you about the history of the Norfolk Navy Yard, which is storied and important. And I wish you luck up there on the Hill for the rest of the week. It seems like it's going to be lit, and I appreciate your trying to preserve our intelligence community at its best, which has always been so important to the country. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your interest. I know it's a little nerdy, but boy, it's really important. The men and women in the intelligence community never get the attention that, say, our military does, but boy, oh boy, they do a damn good job. And I feel like they're under such stress right now. These are not partisan individuals.
If I had it to do over again, I would go into intelligence in the State Department. I find what they do absolutely fascinating, and the reports that come out of there are the best of the best. So I agree with you, and think highlighting them is a great thing. So thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for being here, and we'll hope to talk to you again soon.